The other thing he has that's part of this disintegration is if you think of just even our English notion of like things disintegrating, like when you put like a sugar cube in your tea. And he thinks that when we've sinned, we just keep scattering ourselves and our loves. Every time we love something falsely or we love something in a way that we ought not, we've like dropped off parts of ourselves along the way. It's a striking way of thinking of like what's happening, right, when you have false loves. The way I describe it with my students jokingly is it's like a slug that like leaves this little slime trail. As it goes by, like, and so there's this feeling of like leaving part of yourself behind as you go. So.
Oh man, welcome back to another episode of Drawing Flame.
It's good to be with you, Matt.
Good to be with you, man. I've been thinking a lot. A couple things. We have a few episodes out now. And one thing, I never watch myself. I never watch myself. But I accidentally saw a clip. And one thing I want to work on for the audience's sake is speaking faster. Sometimes I speak way too slow, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is I'm always so afraid of saying something wrong or I'm doing it right now, actually. I'm afraid of saying something wrong or something that is sort of bombastic or like just speaking too quickly and getting out over my skis. So I don't speak like this normally. I want people to know that like when I'm home, I don't speak really slowly. So I'm going to try to speak more naturally.
Is that a therapist thing, though? I always thought that was like your therapy couch voice.
I will say there's something very helpful in therapy about slowing people down. So I do deliberately try to like match, or not match, but actually create a certain environment with my voice that invites clients to slow down.
Is that for like reflectivity or on their part? Or like what is the goal that you're trying to?
Yeah, so often when we speak very quickly and we speak sometimes thoughtlessly, but also sometimes we're speaking in a way that allows us to move past really sort of difficult or painful spots in our story. And by slowing down, part of what it gives me the opportunity to do is to interject.
To catch the moment.
To not get caught up in the rapid speaking, but to sort of catch it and say, hey, wait, I think there was just something there. What was that? And I'm trying to model and I'm trying to model for them sort of a pace that allows us to catch some of that sometimes, to go a little bit slower, to be a little more deliberate, and to allow ourselves to find those moments. And those are moments that I think have tremendous depth, and we want to like turn into them and go within, go deep within.
No, I love that thought because it's I don't know about you, but I find when you talk about slowing down that my interior voice is vastly faster than my exterior voice. Like the interior dialogue that I have is just so much quicker. And it's flying, right? So to what extent can you actually slow down even in your inner dialogue enough to like grab a hold of something to be reflective enough or to be recollected?
I'm trying to think if I've ever noticed a difference in pace between sort of my inner voice and I don't know if I've ever noticed.
I notice every time I try to write or I speak, like when I'm teaching, it's like, how do I like catch up enough to, I'm like my kids running on a hill. Their legs are moving, but it's only a matter of time. Especially my yard. My yard has all these mole holes, and it's like inevitable. The kid's going to step in one and wipe out on the way down.
Their bodies ahead of their feet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually a nice. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the heart, and I've got this sort of idea brewing, and I haven't fleshed it out at all. Not really. But the idea with the heart is something like this. I've noticed that when people live from the heart, and by heart, I don't mean, what I've noticed about the heart is I don't mean something just like a sentimental place.
Right.
And I don't mean an irrational place. The heart for me is this place of actual real knowledge. So it's not irrational, and it's not merely sentimental. It is the place of deep, profound feeling, but not sentimentality. And what I've observed in therapy is it seems to me like often one thing that gets us in trouble or holds us back or contributes to our problems is trying to avoid or cover up the heart. and this makes sense to me, that very often growing up in our life, in our story, we get hurt, we get harmed, our heart gets wounded. And so we learn ways to protect, to preserve, to keep the heart safe. We turn our hearts of flesh into hearts of stone in order to feel safety and security. But I think what I've seen in therapy is that people, when we allow ourselves to live from the heart, and I actually thought, man, that'd be a great book title. And then I went and Googled it, and Coach K, Duke's coach, his autobiography is called
1,087 Wins or whatever it is.
Is it really? Okay. Yeah. So he gets priority in naming his book, Leading from the Heart. But I think there's actually something about living from or leading with the heart that like is a deeply human way of living. And it's a way of living that is vulnerable and it's risky, but it's a way of living where we're able to respond to the people and the situations in front of us from a place of deep humanity and compassion and a place of sincerity and a place of truth. It's like the human way to live. And I think oftentimes when we live that way, we risk being hurt, we risk being harmed. Living from the heart it's a risk, and it takes courage, because you can then be moved by life and by people and by situation. You start to care, you start to love deeply and passionately, and that's hard, because then that means like there's going to be like ups and downs, because I've allowed my heart to be engaged, and there's going to be pains and sorrows, deep and profound joys as well, but deep and profound sorrows. And I think part of what I mean, one way of thinking about therapy, and I think there's a lot of ways of thinking about therapy, but one way of thinking about therapy for me now is I'm trying to help people live from the heart, to live from this place of authenticity, sincerity, like profound humanness. It's a place of risk, it's a place of love, it's a place of, and so this has been really how much we step into the world in defensive mode, guarding our heart, with our intellects, with how quickly we speak, with our accomplishments, with our...
You know, I love what you're saying there, but it strikes me that one of the difficulties is to get people to even have a sense of the heart as something they have.
Yes.
Because of the fact it's so sentimental. I remember this really foolish book I was given as a high schooler, where after I was given like a different book, like, you know, by Pope Benedict or Augustine, my whole life could have changed more quickly or something. I was given this book, and it was called something like The Journey from the Head to the Heart. I don't know. It was supposed to be spiritual reading. It was pretty. Now I'm insulting somebody who wrote this book.
Yeah, they put their heart on the line, and you're just like, yeah,
crushing their book. But the whole book was, and it was this whole thing of like moving from like thinking to emotions, or maybe the book's really good, and I just didn't get it when I was 16.
Yeah.
But I haven't looked at it since. I probably threw it away.
Who wrote it?
I don't know. I mean, there's probably multiple books with it. But what I remember so much from it, and even the way people talk about the heart, is it's this kind of romantic, with a capital R, notion of the heart as like a place of sentimentality. It's a place of feeling. So I think even when you try to talk to people about the heart, I mean, I use that language all the time in theology. I mean, it's a biblical idiom. It's an idiom that's super Augustinian. They push back against it because they immediately have this frame of thinking of it like sentimentality, its emotions, it's all of that.
And therefore it's irrational, and like we shouldn't want to live from there.
Right. And I was even in a class. I was visiting another professor's class, and I was teaching their class, and he brought me in and he wanted me to talk about Augustine. So I was trying to talk about Augustine and the heart and memory and a bunch of these ideas. And you could tell the students, some of them were really quite bright, but they were totally stuck thinking in the mode of like, well, what is this that you're even talking about? And we have our intellect and our will. And they just like kept coming back to this like binary of like intellect, will. I'm a thinking thing, I'm a loving thing.
Yes.
I'm like, well, what's the thing that's thinking? Or what's the thing that's willing? Like, who are you? What's deeper behind those things? But they have this like purely active, kind of just outward facing, like I'm this mind that thinks, I'm this mind that loves. But where is that like space of who's behind the knowing, who's behind the loving? And so I just even found, even with, they were very bright students, but even trying to press them into a space to appreciate like, well, someone has to know, like there's a you that's knowing, there's a you that's loving. What is that self? And it's interesting. I mean, it seems like
is that how you would define? So, I mean, for our audience, Shane has written a book on the heart, Augustine in the heart. Right. And so like, so I don't have a profound definition of it. So But it sounds like you're saying the heart is you. It's like the core or essence of who you are. Something like
Right,
that.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the close. I mean, I don't know if self's the right word because we could import all these modern notions of self, but right. I mean, it's the place to which you withdraw.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's the place that's. I mean, actually, I think the best definition there is in the Catechism.
Of the heart?
Of the heart. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's very Augustinian. They. I won't read the whole of it, right? But I mean, they capture
We've got
this.
time, Shane. Read the whole of it.
Read the whole quote. Yeah. Let me just unpack it. Let me just unpack it here. But I love this because I could try to put it in my own words, but this captures so well. The heart is the dwelling place where I am. Right? And I think that I love this notion is like that whatever I am, we never quite get to naming who I am, but I get that I exist in some inner place.
Yeah.
Where I live, according to the Semitic or biblical expression, the heart is the place to which I withdraw. The heart is our hidden center, beyond the grasp of our reason and of others. Only the Spirit of God can fathom the human heart and know it fully. The heart is the place of decision. Which I love that.
So it's not irrational.
Right? It's not irrational.
Decision being made.
But it's deeper than our psychic drives.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place of truth where we choose life or death. It's a place of encounter. Because in the image of God, we live in relation. It's a place of covenant. Right? So, I mean, there's like 20 elements to it. But I think that definition, so that's 2563.
Okay. Augustine has, somebody texted me this the other day. This is wild. Somebody texted me a quote from book 10 of, here it is.
The heart is where I am.
Yeah.
Or whatever I
am.
Yeah.
Augustine says in book 10 of the Confessions, and yet it is in my heart that I am whatever I am.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because what you hear in some of that is there's a sort of mystery to it. Like even in that definition the Catechism gives, it's sort of like it's not easily defined or like there's a sense of mystery even unto myself, who I am, what I am. And so Augustine says, like, it's in my heart that I am whatever it is I am.
And he uses that language of in even, right? I mean, I find that interesting that it's like in my heart. Like, so there's this even, whatever your heart is, it's a place that you're kind of within. It's a dwelling place. It's a place of withdrawal. It's a place of encounter with God. But it is supposed to be mysterious. And I think that's why this makes it sound like we're taking the easy way out. Like, oh, you don't have philosophical or theological precision. You can't tell me what that is.
That's the concern of it.
Right. And so I feel that, like you're writing a book, you should be able to just really cleanly give this like definition at the outset of it. But I love that quote. I mean, I know in my book I put that quote for sure in it. That quote from book 10. But he allows. I mean, and variously Augustine calls the human person an enigma, an abyss. Right. He talks when he talks about going into your memory, into your heart to look for things. It's like going into these like chasms and caverns, and you have things jumping out at you and startling you, and you're trying to look for things, and they're hiding from you.
I love it.
So there's a very lively or mysterious character to it. But then it's getting people to recognize having a space like that. Is that they're going to have to live from a space like that. They have to admit that they have a space like that. But some of them, do they withdraw there enough to recognize they have such a place?
Yeah. Because I think it's risky to withdraw there for a couple reasons. One, because it seems to me it's a place of encounter. But we don't just encounter God there. There's a real confrontation with ourselves. Like in the journey into these places, these caverns, things do jump out. Parts of yourself, memories, habits, desire, things that sometimes we spend a lot of time, effort, and energy trying to avoid or push away or not look at or distract ourselves from. It seems to me the heart is a place of encounter with ourselves authentically and with the Lord. And to get there feels very vulnerable to sit with ourselves in a sort of poverty of spirit, like who I am. This is me. Here it is. For better or for worse, this is me. But I think there's a profound freedom in that too. When you get to that place, when you're in the heart, there's a freedom. There's a letting go of impressing others, needing accolades. Like to live from the heart is to live honestly. It's to live freely. It's to admit some of these desires that are maybe less than desirable, but you're not living from them. You're acknowledging them. You're seeing them in the cavern, but you're living from a deeper place. And I know this sounds sort of wishy. Like the irony is, I was trained in psychology. Baylor has a great program. It's the top PsyD program in the country. They're amazing. They drive home, and I think to some extent rightfully so, like empirically validated treatments, empirically supported treatments. I want to take psychology very seriously, and I really appreciate that training. But in some ways, the more I sit with human beings and people, and there's a sense, I see some of this, not wishy-washy, but something deep here, like the heart, something that psychology doesn't quite, modern empirical psychology doesn't quite have the language for.
Right.
I think we get at it like conceptually from other things. Like we get at pieces of it.
And do you think that's because psychology is coming from without, right? So I mean, like when
Yeah.
you're sitting there in counseling, you're not that person.
No, right.
And so the empirical, it's like there's only so much that you, as Matt, can do to this other person who's sitting with you,
Yeah.
that you can reach out to, that you can shape, that you can touch on, that you can pull on. But really, to get to the heart or to get the wish, like that wishy-washy space, what that actually requires, and that's what Augustine's doing in his entire life, but in particular, that kind of work like the Confessions, is you actually have to be the one to do it yourself.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, but I also think what I've found is that when I sit with people a certain way, when I'm more in touch with the heart in myself, and I sit with somebody in a certain way, it seems to give them the freedom, or it seems to open up space for them to be willing to step into that themselves.
Right.
That if I just come from without in sort of a sterile way, a less than human way, a sort of that there's a way of like being deeply human, deeply myself in this healing relationship.
People want to respond to.
Yeah, that people are more likely to respond to willingly and genuinely and authentically, and open themselves up to look at those monsters under the bed or in the caverns.
Under the beds of their heart.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it's striking to me because what you're suggesting is not only is the heart like a place of encounter that with yourself, with God, but actually precisely maybe the best way of going to your heart sometimes is to encounter other people or invite other people into encountering that space, right? Like that you actually have to like take someone with you, or at least for me, this is only going to happen through a kind of external process. Like I'm going to have to vocalize this. I'm going to have to think about it. And it's only once you name it, or sometimes once someone else names it.
Yeah.
Like someone else says something, you're like, oh, actually, you precisely named exactly what was bothering me about that situation.
100%.
Right. And so there's this the encounter is demanded to even begin to have that self-knowledge. And one of the things I love in Augustine's Confession, that's a small hint of this, that he does is in the first half of the Confessions, no characters have names. Saint Monica's just his mother. His father's just his father.
When do they get named? What book does he start naming them?
It's book 7 or 8, I think. So it's like right around the middle point that he starts giving people their names. The only one exception is Faustus, who's this Manichaean like bishop who he talks with, heretical bishop. And I think he just names him because you need he was a known historical entity, right, that you needed to name, so you knew who he was talking about. But he's got a childhood friend who dies, and he has this whole extended reflection on the trauma this was, that when he was like 16, his best friend of his died, and he talks about like walking around feeling like he himself was dead. I mean, it's this whole thing, but even then, the friend's not named. His
Interesting.
He's like, I guess what you don't know what to call her, common law wife, concubine, whatever she was, who's unnamed. He never names her. For all of his love, he talks about how it was like having a part of his soul ripped out. He doesn't name her, right? But it's only once he comes to God and he's coming towards baptism and he experiences conversion, he starts living from the heart, right? That identities begin to emerge, right? That you begin to, his mother as Monica, his friends as Alypius and Nebridius, his father as Patrick, right? So there's something even about like this ability to come out of himself. And so one of the things I always wrestle with what this interiority is Augustine, at the same time as he's talking about this heart as a place of dwelling, it's a place where you withdraw, as Book 10 says, that whatever I am is there in my heart, that I am that. Is at the same time, his definition for sin is curvatus in se, to be caved in on yourself. So then one of the things that maybe me just think out loud here with you about is like, okay, what's the difference between being caved in on yourself in a way that's like sinful or collapsing versus a kind of interiority that actually allows you to go within yourself and count yourself, but actually then makes you more human, able to draw this better out of other people.
Yeah.
Because it does seem like, I think about that a lot, is my mind is always going 1,000 miles per hour, but there's times where totally that could be like selfish, that retreat into that mental space. But there's other times that's going into the heart.
Other direct. Yeah, that to me sort of is this like self-preservation distinction, that when I'm not living from the heart, I'm trying to protect the heart in some way. And I end up sort of caved in upon myself, either protecting or preserving the heart, guarding the heart, hardening the heart. But when I'm living from the heart, it's a sitting or a resting place that like allows me to know myself, but I'm not focused on protecting myself, so I'm actually focused on like on loving the other, on being. It feels to me too like when I'm in the heart, or I'm helping people live from the heart, it creates a receptivity to the other. That when I'm caved in upon myself, I can't receive the other, but to live from the heart is to have a sort of openness to like you, who you are, your uniqueness, your value, your to see something in you. I think there's a unique vision when you live from the heart too. It gives you a perspective that you don't always see when you're living just from maybe the intellect or something. You see, maybe it's easier to see beyond the faults, the failings, the deficits, the shortcomings of the person, and to sort of grasp their fundamental goodness, to like, to see something more deeply and maybe more truthfully than just what the surface or external appearances seem to indicate, more than just what the behaviors seem to indicate.
Yeah. What's striking me is it's just like there's a lot of our ways that our human encounters, relationships, interactions can be so calculated. Right. You encounter this person. And it's easy to do that professionally, especially like in a professional setting. But even like, you're making a new friend and you're like, want this person to like you, or you want them to be your friend. Or, when you're recording a woman at one point, and you have like all these elaborate calculations.
I thought you said when you're recording a woman.
Courting.
When you're courting. Don't record. Yeah, when you're courting a woman. Yes, good.
Yeah, there's some strange calculations. No, courting. But like you have, and I think what's happening then is there's a kind of paralysis that comes to you, right? Because like part of what struck me when you were just talking about that, living from the heart, is there's a kind of like singularity or simplicity with which you just act. Like the freedom comes and that you're just acting.
That's the freedom.
You're not calculating, you're not questioning, you're not, and
so
then I'm allowed to.
What's it going to cost? How much it,
All right, it's like, no, actually, I just want to have a conversation with Matt. I want to know what Matt's having. I'm not having all these other thoughts, right? I want to review that. But that when that calculating, when those gears are turning, it's really hard to feel free at any point in that conversation.
That's right. Let me ask this question of you. I don't know a ton about your book. I think we talked about it like 3 weeks ago, and I completely forget, if I'm being totally honest. What is it?
Yeah. So the book, which is now going through its final editing stages, is called Return to the Heart.
Okay.
Return to the Heart, which, I mean, you can see where these ideas are coming through, right? But it's on Augustine's biblical theology, or biblical spirituality, excuse me, Return to the Heart. But what I try to do is
what's the thrust?
I'm trying to walk them through the Confessions in a certain way, which is an incredibly difficult book, but in a way that's not a textbook. So I don't want to give them kind of a philosophical or theological commentary. It's not going like book by book. For those who don't know what the Confessions is, book by book is like the chapters, right? Book by book through the Confessions. Good, There's 13 chapters, so to speak, 13 books. But I'm not doing that. It's not trying to be a textbook. It's not trying to be a commentary. Like, that's not what the goal is, because it's not like I want this for classroom use. In a certain way, I have found the Confessions unbelievably fruitful for me, precisely for figuring out how to live from the heart myself, or like understanding what I'm doing psychologically. The number of times where I feel like as a mentor, as a professor, or in conversations with friends, I am like mining the Confessions for like practical insights. For people, it's stunning to me. And oftentimes I'm not like, of course, citing the Confessions to them. It's just like something I've absorbed. And I remember I gave a talk. I was back in Louisiana at my previous job, and I gave a talk to a bunch of high schoolers. And it was about identity and, coming to understand themselves in the image and likeness of God, and their identity in God, and all these various meditations. And I remember one of my colleagues saying when I got done, he's like, Augustine could have given that talk, right? Which I thought was like one of the great compliments.
That's a huge compliment.
But it wasn't like I was citing Augustine or doing anything, but it was just like kind of in the Augustinian modality or something. So what I really want to do in the book is I select themes, topics. And what I want to do is walk people through those in a kind of Augustinian mode. And so it's the heart is chapter 1, then memory, sin, friendship, death, Jesus.
Got it.
Basically what those
the chapters are.
The chapters. And then with the goal that you can move from these one to the next in a way that allows you to really understand how Augustine helps you understand what's going on in your own life, but also the scriptures. So each of the chapters has some kind of scriptural passage that I use to kind of like show where the grounding of this is, kind of in a biblical spirituality, what Augustine's trying to do.
Why the title? Like,
so
the heart's the first chapter, but...
I mean, Augustine, for him, sin, one of his main definitions of sin, I think is really quite striking, is disintegration. Disintegration. And so what he's playing off of is this gift that Adam and Eve had of integrity. You have a master's degree in theology. You must have learned this at some point. You may have forgotten.
I may have heard it.
Right. But integrity being our original constitution as God intended us to be, in particular meaning that our soul governs our body, and then within our soul, our faculties are orderly properly, right? Intellect governs will governs the passions or emotions, and right, so you have this kind of ordering of the human being. And so Augustine thinks, okay, well, one of the things that's happened in sin is this has just gotten completely whacked out, right? Like this is completely out of order. That oftentimes our body is deciding what our soul is going to do, and our various appetites. He uses the example of just trying to wake up in the morning and get out of bed.
I don't relate. I don't know. What do you mean, Augustine? I'm so sorry.
It's usually my my 1-year-old daughter coming screaming into the room.
I'm catching a knee in the side of the cheek.
I have to get up at
7 o'clock.
That's a problem for celibate theologians.
Yeah. Bishops don't have this problem.
Yeah. So that you have this like the body govern it, but then that you use your intellect actually to rationalize your passions or your will, right? So he thinks all that. But the other thing he has that's part of this disintegration is if you think of just even our English notion of like things disintegrating, like when you put like a sugar cube in your tea. And he thinks that when we've sinned, we just keep scattering ourselves and our loves. Every time we love something falsely or we love something in a way that we ought not, we've like dropped off parts of ourselves along the way. It's a striking way of thinking of like what's happening, right? When you have false loves. The way I describe it with my students jokingly is it's like a slug that like leaves this little slime trail. As it goes by, like, and so there's this feeling of like leaving part of yourself behind as you go. So there's this need to return, right? There's this need to come back to, and we use all these idioms in English that evoke that. I need to like gather myself. I need to pull myself together. Let me gather my thoughts. I'm feeling really scattered right now, right? Like we have all these notions in which we either describe ourselves needing to be pulled back together and made whole, or we're feeling pulled apart. But maybe the clearest scriptural text he's evoking is the prodigal son story. And it's alternatively translated in Luke 15 when you have the prodigal son. But the prodigal son's sitting there, he's with the swine, he longs to eat even the pods that the swine are eating. And then it's alternatively translated, but one valid translation of it is, and then he came to himself. And Augustine hones in on this idea that actually what happened with the prodigal son is that he actually and his son had like left himself behind. That he had that there was this division in his innermost being. Like if we use the heart image, he had left his heart and wandered off to some distant country. Right? There wasn't that. And so what's happening, and he thinks it's like obviously grace has to be moving in this, is that the prodigal son is being moved into a desire to be made whole again, to return, to go back, to come back to himself, to pull himself together, to gather himself. And so that whole notion of a kind of return, I think, evokes the extent to which we are away from that and need to return back.
Disintegrated?
That
away from
disintegrated,
ourselves.
we're pulled apart, that we're distant from ourselves. He has this whole image of like God is waiting with our actual self, and we just have to go back to ourselves because that's where God is.
I love it. So to me though, it's risky. It sounds so easy, right? I mean, it's like, oh yeah, just return to yourself. But I think about all the ways and reasons that the reasons we've left ourselves behind. Why have we left ourselves behind? What's drawn us out? False loves, false affections, fear, anxiety, trying to get the attention or approval of others, there's all these things that have governed and dictated why we've left ourselves. And to return to ourselves is to let go of some of these things. It's to risk being different in friendships. I mean, to think about returning to myself might mean I'm different. I let go of the certain thing that I think has made me who I am, that I've constructed, that I've built. Oh, you're the funny guy, you're the smart guy, you're the hard worker, you're the dedicated guy who's grit and always working. And what if it's not? Like, what if I adopted those as ways to get things I think I needed, things I think I was made for that I didn't receive? To let those go and to return to myself might be not to be the guy who's in first and out last. It might mean that I'm not the person who's always people pleasing and so agreeable.
People aren't going to like you, or
maybe I'm less agreeable when I really return to myself. Maybe I'm willing to say what I actually dislike when I return to myself. It seems to me like it sounds so simple and beautiful. I think it is, but that's actually, I like that as a sort of way of thinking about therapy. Is it's a return to oneself, but it means you're letting go of, it means you're risking, it means you're looking at the parts of yourself you've adopted that have become sort of your false self, this distanced self. Yeah, and that's real work, and it's not done just like, oh, I'm just going to return to myself. I mean, sometimes we have moments of conversion that maybe are like that. They feel like a profound return to oneself. And I think that happens, and that's these moments of grace. But maybe the therapeutic way of doing it is like going line by line, case by case, situation by situation, and understanding ourselves, and understanding why we distance ourselves, and understanding what it would mean to go back. What does it cost us to distance ourselves? What was I seeking when I distanced myself? And what's the suffering? I always think that when we distance ourselves from our true self, we've done it to avoid some suffering or some perceived suffering. But when we return to ourselves, there's going to be a suffering too. I mean, it's sort of a...
I think that suffering is honestly probably kind of unknown. If I think of the prodigal son story, right, he's told his father he wishes his father's dead because he wants the inheritance.
Yeah.
So like, give me my share of the inheritance. I wish you were already dead. Let's get out of here. And then he leaves, right? And he goes off to a distant country, Choron Makron, right? So some kind of far off place, very far from his family, probably different language, different religion, different culture, right? So he's somewhere far away. And when he comes back, he has this fear, right, of his ability to re-enter his father's home. And so he's been reciting that speech, right? I've sinned against God and against you, right? Let me just be treated as one of your servants. And you can see his fear is all built around reciting this speech and being forgiven, and he doesn't even care about being restored to being a son. He just wants to be a servant. Because really what's driving him in a part to return to himself is he's hungry,
Yes.
and he knows his dad will give him food.
Yeah.
Right?
He's suffering.
So he's suffering. So there's this kind of suffering. So I'm going to go back. But what's one of the things that strikes me about coming back to yourself is you actually don't know what you're going to end up confronting.
Exactly.
Because when he comes back, that whole excuse he never actually gives to give the speech.
Yeah.
His father just runs out and embraces him. But then what all of a sudden he's confronted with, as you were talking about, it's his older brother. The real suffering that's introduced in that story is his older brother's like, who the heck are you? And why are you back? And why are you getting the fatted calf? And I don't like you. I'm not even going to come to the party. Right? So all those dynamics. And you imagine there were a myriad of other things that had to be unpacked. But we at least get that insight into the older brother and the disdain of the older brother, who refers to him, right, when his father comes to him and he says, like, your son. It's not his brother anymore, it's your son. And he accuses him of swallowing up the inheritance with harlots, which nothing about the story says anything about harlotry. There's a lot of ways to waste money other than harlotry, at least that I can imagine spending money on, right? So I think that idea of the vulnerability or the poverty of coming back to yourself, you don't actually know what's going to be the thing that you're confronted by, or the thing that you're going to realize most is bothering you. So Augustine, when he's going through his kind of the final climax towards his conversion, he keeps talking about how God has to keep picking him up and putting him back in front of himself. It's like this funny image because he keeps turning away from himself.
Yeah, you want it. So, yeah, another thing, sort of part of the way I think about therapy or growth or healing is so much of our problem is driven by avoidance.
Right.
Like, I don't want, no, that's painful, I don't want to look at it. It's painful, I want to avoid it. It's painful, I want to distract, dress up, cover. And so having to gently be, I mean, one way that I sort of try to do this is I try to gently bring people into a place where they're invited to hold their suffering a little bit. And so we hold it, and then we might come up because it feels like too much. We catch our breath, and then we're gonna turn back or be put in front of ourselves again, we're gonna go back to that thing that feels like a suffering. And maybe two things that happen there is, one is I increase my ability to hold distress and suffering. And there's something to that. Like, as I realize, wait, I can hold hard things. I can sustain and handle hard and difficult sufferings. And I don't need to react to them. I don't need to avoid them. I don't need to disengage from them. I can actually just hold uncomfortable feelings, thoughts, experience. I can hold them. So increasing in distress tolerance. Scott said this once. He said, part of what I think Jesus does is he teaches us how not to be so afraid of suffering. And so every time we're afraid of suffering, one impulse is to turn away from ourselves, to turn to all the glitz and the glamour, the lights, the distractions, the cell phone. What are all the ways I turn away from myself? And to be put back in front of ourselves. Nope. Oh, Nope, I'm actually feeling afraid right now. That's where I am. Or nope, I'm actually feeling overwhelmed right now. That's like where I am. Or no, I'm actually feeling totally vulnerable and insecure right now. But that's where I am, really deeply, truly right now. And I don't have to turn away from that. I don't have to. Yeah, I wonder what the younger brother was even. What's he running from? Like you know, yeah. What draws one out like that? You know, was it boredom? Was it the work of home? Was it not feeling like he had meaning or purpose or like, you know, it's easy to just pick, oh yeah, he left. But like there's some, you know, oftentimes I tend to think he was probably avoiding something.
It's funny. I mean, it's fun to psychoanalyze the story, right? To wrestle with it. I mean, a few different things occur to me. One is we were talking about this, like the idea of a self you construct. Is perhaps there's this desire, especially in the ancient world, where your life is so dictated by the home in which you're born, right? Your career is your father's career. You're going to probably live in the same house. You marry someone who's part of the same clan as you, right? I mean, things are very... So this whole idea that he goes off to this Tron Makra in this distant country in a faraway place, is like, I'm going to make something of myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm gonna do something. And we flex this muscle in different ways. I mean,
Exactly.
I remember, like, it's anecdotal, but it's just a funny example of this. I remember as a high schooler, like my dad ran track in college, was a fantastic cross-country track runner, like sub 2-minute half mile.
Yeah.
A guy, like really fast, really gifted athlete. My brother, very good track cross-country adventurer. So of course, I'm the younger brother. What do? I'm gonna run cross-country.
Yeah.
I'm going through this like crisis as like a sophomore in high school, and you know, a girl breaks up with me after dating for like a month. Right? This is not significant, but like in a 16-year-old's mind, right? This is like, and so like, I don't know what, in this space of wanting to be like, I'm going to create, not feeling seen, not feeling heard, whatever, whether that's true or not, that perceived this, what I begin to do is I quit the cross-country team.
Yeah.
Because it's like, right, this is my distant country. I'm going to do something that's not the family thing.
Yes.
I'm going to do something that's not running cross-country and track, because that's what Dad does, that's what Troy does, but it's not what I'm going to do. I was miserable. I hated it. It was stupid. I loved cross-country. So senior year, I went back and I ran cross-country again, and there I was with all my best friends. Right? But it wasn't even like I wanted any of the things. It was wanting that desire to like push out and claim a space.
For myself. Yeah.
Right? So especially because of the way the story is presented, when the older brother speaks at the end of the parable, the older brother says, I have slaved away for you for all these years and obeyed all your commandments, and I never was even given a baby goat to eat with my friends. There's something about the older brother. The older brother does everything right. Right? The older brother is the one, he's slaving away, he's working in the fields. Where is he found in the parable? The party's going on, and the older brother's out there in the fields working. Right? He's the worker. He's the worker. He's the diligent one. He's always obedient. And you also wonder if that younger brother, if there's something of a, like, well, I'm not going to measure up to, I'm not my older brother. I'm not going to measure up to him.
So, I mean, is there some avoidance? I can't live up to that.
So I'm going to go out and, you know, do your own.
Yeah, and sometimes even the perfection of the older brother can be a type of avoidance. I want to avoid feeling like I'm not, the feeling of like maybe I'm not lovable or I'm not good enough or I'm not, maybe working in perfection. Yeah.
It's like he expected that if he just kept working, his dad was going to show up and give him something.
Yeah.
Because the father's response in the parable is, right, you are with me always.
He's always been with me.
All I have is yours.
Yeah.
The implication is you could have just taken a baby goat. You could have asked for it. Like the implication is like you would have had it.
Yeah.
It would have been yours.
It's not the work that gets you. Yeah.
Right. And so you get both of those kind of vices, right? You get the person who's going to just work and pursue it and like slave away. Like there's certainly, I think many of us do that in the spiritual, you know, life. It's like, oh gosh, if I don't pray my rosary tonight, I'm definitely getting a cold tomorrow.
I'm getting smited. God with the finger in the smite button.
Right, or something like that. But the other same, there's that also this, right? So it's hard to know precisely. But
let me ask you this. So a book like this, I mean, does it have practical import? I mean, obviously they're you know, I know I do this all the time. Actually, I noticed I dislike it about myself, but I always try to answer people's objections before I try to anticipate them and so I want to give all these caveats before I ask the question, because I know I'm imagining people are going to say something like, well, it doesn't matter. There are plenty of good things that you should do for their own sake that don't just have practical implications. Anyway, I want to get better at not trying to anticipate everyone's objections first and give all these caveats, because I think
it's a protective instinct.
It's a totally protective instinct. I want to avoid the pain of reading the comment section and being criticized, but I'm going to try to live from my heart. So, the practical import of something like this, a text like this, not only for the reader, like your book, but is it the kind of thing that could shape a father reading it to be a better father, a husband reading it to be a better husband? Does your book have is it predominantly an intellectual endeavor, or will it help the reader return to the heart and live as having like rediscovered themselves?
No, I mean, it's a beautiful question. The thing that's interesting about this book has not been born of like a classroom or of academic exercises. That actually most of what is in the book was first born of retreats, like retreat talks I'd give, parish missions I'd be invited to give, Lenten or Advent missions, and so it was actually in distinctly spiritual mode where you have someone pulled aside for a retreat or a parish mission. So that was where it was flowing out of. I wouldn't say I'm practical because I don't feel like I'm experienced enough as a husband or father to give like actual concrete advice. Like this is like what you should be doing, like disciplining your children, or like this is how you should resolve conflict with your wife, because we have no conflict in our marriage. I have no advice to give.
This is another form of avoidance.
I have a wonderful, wonderful marriage. I'm very happy. But
healthy conflict. It's got good, healthy conflict.
But definitely what I hope the book does is invite people into a space where they do return to their heart. And one of the ways I see that most happening is I almost want people, not that I actually think people should write these as books because no one's going to read them and they won't get published, but for people to begin to do something like write their own confessions. Like to be able to, at least in their own mind, or to people they love, or people with whom they are close, to actually speak from the heart and tell stories. And to tell them in a way that's not the same rehashed way that you've told the story 1,000 times, but is actually trying to explore the story, understand what's at the root of it, or I'm seeing this in a different light, or realizing. One of the things that Augustine notes that I think is so fascinating that he says is, we don't just remember that we, like certain things we learn how we learned them. We remember how we learned them, right? So like we have the factual information, but we remember the story they come with.
Yeah.
So for some like really memorable things, like we were joking before this started, like I can remember knowing that chinchillas have more hairs per follicle than any other mammal.
Page 70
of the Osborne Book of Animals.
Yeah.
Right? And you think, why do you remember? Like, that's bizarre. That's a really extreme example, right, of the chinchilla memory. A childhood friend of ours had a chinchilla, and it is like the fluffiest creature on earth. It's delightful. We should make sweaters out of them.
We want to have a pet on set. We want to have an animal that we start bringing.
Let's pet my chinchilla. Right? But I remember that. But I think that happens at a deeper, like, spiritual level for us. That when in our heart, when we learn certain things, they're built into a narrative structure, and so that becomes powerful for us. So our ability to narrate that, or think about that, or who said that particular thing to us becomes tremendously important. We don't just remember the thing; we remember who it comes from, and that carries like its own weight.
Yeah, I have two thoughts about that I think are. So the first thought is maybe more superficial, but it's Augustine in writing the story. Maybe the Confessions itself is a return to the heart. Precisely. Like in writing his story, he is like coming back to himself. And so part of what you said was people write their own stories. That these are writing our story like this can be a way of returning. But you mentioned something else. This is something I've been fascinated with in the therapy literature. So there's something like 500 different therapies, right? And people are creating therapies all the time. Oh, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to, And then there's like, there's a handful of ones that have been like empirically validated, like this works, this works, this works. Overwhelmingly, when you look at the different therapies, if you just take a subset of them, like trauma therapies, you've got prolonged exposure, you've got CBT for trauma, you've got EMDR, you've got cognitive processing therapy. When they put them head to head and say which one's more effective, now they all propose different mechanisms. They all tell a different story about how trauma works and how it impacts you, and then how to get out of that. They're all about equally effective, despite having different claims about what's happening. They're all about equally effective, and you see this across disorders and across therapies. There are very few exceptions. One of the few exceptions is that like prolonged exposure is like the most effective thing for specific phobias. So if you're afraid of spiders or snakes, like overwhelmingly talking about your childhood memories with or talking about your childhood attachments to your parents is not as effective. It's just like,
Here's a spider on the table.
Yeah,
It's not killing you. You're fine.
exactly, right? But for things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, like most of the major disorders, most of the major therapies are equally effective. That's sort of interesting. And so the question is, are there common factors between all the therapies that are what's actually at work here? It's not the specific ingredients, but it's the common factors. Okay. The second interesting thing is that when you see the way most therapies work, people get better in therapy. It's like been shown time and time again. People get better. But it tends to be incremental and over time, right? So your symptoms get better slowly and over time. They reduce slowly and over time. So you've got this sort of, slow line, right? But in some cases, you see problem, nothing. Like the total absence of the problem. So there's been this whole, and it seems like the psychotherapy literature hasn't been able to figure out sort of like why.
Why those cases?
Yeah. And so this entirely independent, and I promise I'll bring it back here, this entirely independent line of research coming out of the memory world. And this is where Augustine memory, now I know he thinks about memory differently, but out of the memory research, something called memory reconsolidation. And so here's what they found. They found that when you experience an event, right, something happens, not only do you have a memory for the specific content, like what happened, the facts of the event, but you also have something that you might call emotional learning or semantic memory, which is like what you learned about it. So, a girl breaks up with you at 16. So you have the details of the event. You have the memory. I was here, she was there, she said this, I was wearing this, I cried, she cried, okay. But then you have there's another set of memory that's operant as well, which is, what did I learn? What's sort of the emotional learning? I learned that if you put your heart on the line, it gets broken, right? The problem with our experiences is that we oftentimes encode a sort of semantic memory or some sort of emotional learning along with it that's inaccurate. And what happens is we go through the world and life, and that is constantly being activated or triggered by all
time that memory is summoned.
Yes.
So is the
Yes.
compatible semantic.
So here's what they found. This is fascinating. They found that if you can activate the old memory, and one of the ways that's indicated that you're in the old memory is that there's affect. Like there's feeling.
Taken back.
Yeah, so I don't care that people cry in session. It's not crying that is of any interest to me specifically. It's that crying oftentimes indicates that we're in the memory. We've returned to a memory. We've activated a memory. And so I want that memory activated. And what the memory reconsolidation literature found was that when that memory is activated, if you can provide what they call memory mismatch or like disconfirming evidence.
Pull them apart. Yeah,
so that memory has prediction in it. In the literature, sometimes they call it predictive error. But that memory has a prediction in it. When this thing happens, I get rejected. When this thing happens, people hurt me. It's got prediction built into it from the semantic memory. If you can provide, when that memory is activated for the client, if you can provide prediction error or memory mismatch, don't act the way the memory thinks you're going to act. So if the person thinks you're going to pull back and become distant, lean in and say, what happened? That must be so painful.
Because they've been trained to think everything otherwise.
What happens is that predictive error or memory mismatch disrupts the sort of connection between the two. I'm sort of speaking about this crudely, but disrupts it.
Right.
And you can actually give new learning, new semantic memory that then gets re-encoded with that memory. So you have a 6-hour window, about a 5 to 6 hour window when you've activated that memory to provide relearning. And then that memory then gets re-encoded with the new learning. So here's what they've sort of found. They found that the way traditional therapy tends to work is through what you call competitive encoding, which is you think you're a piece of garbage and nobody likes you, and I teach you, no, you have dignity and value and people do like you. And you learn this slowly.
And you have to make enough new memories that are supplying new semantic
But you're also, but it's always, it's competitive because you're always like, it's an effort. You're sort of like, no, I remember my therapist told me that I am good enough. It's a sort of purely intellectual endeavor where I feel like a piece of garbage that gets activated. But then I go, no, my therapist told me I'm not. And then I have to sort of remember, like, I did this thing and people liked me. And so you haven't gotten rid of the old memory.
Which may have actually more effective power.
Exactly.
Because it's not just your therapist telling you something or something that you had to brainstorm. This one time someone said something nice to me.
And it's oftentimes you've been acting on this in such a habitual way that it's being reinforced so many times. And in times of particular stress or distress, you almost always default to the old learning, almost always. But like, it's so the reason this literature posits that we tend to get better incrementally and over time, right, slowly over time, is because you have competitive encoding happening. You're trying to build up the new memories and the new learning to be bigger and more powerful than the old learning. But the old learning never goes away, never goes away. You're always just trying to be bigger than it. Kind of push it down, tamp it down, not react to it. It's competitive encoding. This new body of literature says, in fact, we don't need to have competitive encoding, old memories and new memories. We can give the old memory new meaning, new learning, and re-encode that old memory. And that's the drop-off, is that it can't be active. When that old memory is activated, it has new learning in it. Right. And so there's something here, I think. So I was talking to Rashad. Rashad heard a talk I gave on memory reconsolidation. And Rashad's the guy that sent me that text. Rashad Raymond, we want to have him on the show. He's just a philosophy professor, super talented, super smart guy, but has written on Augustine. And he said, Matt, I wonder if there's something here with the memory reconsolidation and what Augustine's doing in writing the Confessions and writing it from a new light, writing it from the perspective of like what God's grace was doing and is doing. So by writing it, this is fascinating as a therapeutic intervention, but by writing it, he's likely reactivating. Like when you write about the death of your friend, you're slowing down, you're in it, and you start writing about the death of your friend, and you feel it, if you allow yourself to. You feel it, and it's activated. And then it seems like Augustine tries to maybe view it now in light of God's grace or what God was doing, or what he makes it relational in these sort of prayers he gives in the midst of it. It's like, is he doing something new? Like, is there a memory reconsolidation thing maybe happening here?
Well, I definitely think it is. And what I love about how you're describing that is it comes back to something we were talking about earlier with the avoidance mechanism and needing to be brought back in front of your face again. Is because of probably the fear precisely of that activation. I don't want to go back to those emotions because Augustine has this funny image for the memory that it's the heart's stomach and it vomits things back up, which is not
memory is the heart's stomach.
And it like vomit. Right, but precisely because this idea that you like taste it over again. And sometimes it doesn't taste so good when you vomit it back up.
Yeah.
So you have this avoidance mechanism. I don't want to be put back in front of myself. I don't want to go back to that hurt or that trauma or whatever it is. I've been trying for years to move past it. And by move past it, we primarily mean I'm just never going to think about it ever again. I'm not going to talk to that person. I'm not going to go back to that place. I'm not going to...
Nothing that triggers it, activates it. Yep.
Delete all songs that could ever be associated. Whatever. I mean, this was just you can think of like the funny things you go to in various points in our life to delete some...
100%.
Right? Going to delete my Facebook. Just start all over again with new people in my life. Whatever those...
Hypothetically.
Whatever those moments are in our life that allow us to kind of to avoid. What Augustine's inviting himself to, and I think what he invites us to, and what I think in the book is you can't do that. Those memories actually never go away. No. Because then they become the things as soon as you go in the cavern, they're like the little gremlin who jumps out to say hi. And you have to confront him or you just leave the caves again, and then you never go back into your heart.
100%.
Because you're just waiting for that to leap out at you. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. And Augustine, one of the things he wants to do is, okay, let's bring back out that memory. Because in bringing that memory back out, he wouldn't use it the same way you're talking about. But yeah, can I assign new content to that? And or can I put it in a new narrative structure? So it's funny, my wife Esther's the first person who ever noticed this. When we first met, if you would ask me my conversion story, I would have told you this dramatic story about going to the University of Miami, which is Sodom and Gomorrah, which it was. Entirely accurate description of Miami. Wonderful place to study and learn. I had great professors, but the debauchery of...
Great football team.
The
at least in the 80s.
eighth floor of my dorm was...
Were they co-ed dorms?
co-ed dorms, alternating male-female, floors, all visitation possible. Really good idea.
Dude, my freshman year, I was at Georgetown for 2 years, and it was co-ed. So there were men and women on the same floor. My freshman year, it was to the left where it was a girls' room. To the right was guys' room.
Wildly bad idea. Wildly bad idea.
There's actually some literature on that. Maybe what a bad idea that is. We could talk about that some other episode.
Right, so I'm there, and I'm just so traumatized. And I got a Catholic school my whole life. A great gift from my parents, for which I'm forever grateful. Right?
How'd you end up at Miami? The U.
They got a huge endowment, and they gave me a full ride.
Wow.
And so it was the closest school to home I applied to. It's actually the only school in the state of Florida I applied to. I had this dream of going to some Georgetown
Notre Dame.
Preppy big city, Catholic school, run by Jesuits and probably in all likelihood, or like Columbia University.
Yeah.
Or whatever. So, I also got honest about what winter was. I got into Cornell and got into Miami, and then I was like, I'm not going to Ithaca, New York.
Stop.
That's freaking insane. I was talking to this person on the phone. She was like a representative from like the admissions office, and she was like, "It's not that bad here. We only had 155 inches of snow last year." And I was just like, wait, what did you just say?
Can you say that again?
Where are you from?
Yeah.
She's like, "Oh, I'm from Ottawa." I'm like, "Yeah, okay, give me a break. I'm from Florida. Did you read my admissions file? I've never lived in snow in my entire life." And then my dad and I were like looked online, and for breakfast they have like split pea soup. I'm like, this is an awful place that God is entirely forsaken. I found out they had the highest suicide rate of
Cornell?
of any university.
At that time. Put a caveat on there.
Yeah,
At that
it
time.
might not be the case now.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I didn't go for a myriad of reasons. But so I go to Miami, which is not. I mean, it's funny. The reputation from the school, you have Catholics versus convicts, the whole rivalry with Notre Dame. They're famous for like kind of thug you kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And that's kind of true of the football team and our fans and the football team, and I delight in them. And I had the great fun going to football games with our locals. The university's not that. The university is like a preppy private school of like 6,000 students.
Oh, for real?
And it's like it's like top 40 school in America. So it's not what you would get the impression of from watching the football team.
Got it.
By any stretch of the imagination, right? Yeah.
That's totally new
Michael
learning.
Irvin does not represent, the University of Miami.
Interesting.
As much as I love him. Or The Rock, Dwayne The Rock.
Yeah, we're doing
We had him speak for commencement. That's like...
And the wisdom is seared in your mind and heart forever, I bet. Yeah.
The wisdom he can bring us. So I'm there, and I just go, I have to go to the church. I don't know where else to go. I was not a daily mass going Catholic. My family wasn't either. But I just like show up to this like daily mass at St. Augustine's. Funnily enough, in Lourdes Providence, there it is. St. Augustine's.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
So I go to this little church, and the priest was newly assigned, Father Michael, who ended up becoming my spiritual director, transformed my life. But he gave this homily. He's Irish, and he gave this homily about how Irish priests, when they would leave Ireland, would bring a bag of Irish soil with them so that when they died, they knew they were never going back. They could be buried under Irish soil.
That's beautiful.
It's a beautiful image. And so he said, well, all of you are probably feeling like lost and lonely because here you are at university and you're not at home and you're in a different place. And just know the church is like that little bag of soil that you can take with you everywhere. I mean, it just like cut me to the heart. I was like, this is awesome. I got this like weird challenge that is weird for a college freshman. I was like, I'm gonna go to as many daily masses in a row as I can, which I think I hit like 46 or something as a college first semester freshman. And I get invited to go to this retreat. There's like a whole lot of details in this story, but long story short, I get invited to go to this retreat with campus ministry. And for whatever reason, I assume there's going to be like hotel-like accommodations on this retreat. I'd never been on a campus ministry retreat. So I show up and I have like nothing. I have clothes, like in a suitcase, but like toiletries, soap, towels, like whatever. I did bring a towel. I did remember a towel, but I think I knew that there was like a lake you could swim in. So I brought like I think it was like a Aladdin towel from my youth. But then it turns out that you were supposed to have bedding and things because there's like these cots. And so I'm like, well, I guess I'm just not going to sleep. I have no bedding. I have no toiletries to shower.
You stayed up all night and prayed.
I did. I stayed up all night in adoration because I had nothing else to do. And I was freezing my tush off because it was so cold and this over air. It was like 90 degrees outside at night because it's Florida.
Yeah.
And it was like 70, 60 degrees inside, so you're freezing. And I have this towel. I'm like wrapped up in my Aladdin towel in adoration all night. So if you heard me tell my conversion story, I would have placed everything on that. What I always called the towel retreat. Because I like sat there in my towel praying all night. And there's a certain truth to that. But as I talked about this more and more with Esther over the years and got married and I continued, and people would ask my conversion story, how I got to like be a theology professor.
Yeah.
Esther started being like, I feel like you overemphasize that story. Because we'd be talking and I would like bring something up from my high school years and she'd be like, what? That doesn't like sound like you just had this like conversion in like October of your freshman year. Like I would randomly in high school leave lunch early, I would just like start feeling like really disengaged. Like I could care less about this meaningless conversation with this person. And I would just like leave the lunch table and I'd go into the chapel. I'd go into the,
Oh, so
which
it
was,
wasn't like this one-off moment that,
I'd go into this chapel by myself. There's no one there.
Yeah.
Like our high school wasn't like the kind of place where people were praying in the chapel in the middle of the day. I'd walk in and I would like I'd get as close to the tabernacle as I could and I would just like pray there next to the tabernacle, awkwardly in the sanctuary. So if someone walked in, they'd be like, what are you doing up there? Right? And so
Talking to Jesus, that's what I'm doing.
but it's like, okay, that's suggestive that probably
100%.
the Lord's working something else in your life sooner than that Tao retreat.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you, like those building blocks, sometimes that you kind of step back, is that it takes it took me telling that story a heck of a lot of times, and took telling it to the same person, and a person who I've opened my heart to,
Yes.
more than anyone else in my entire life, right? My spouse, Esther, for her to begin to name that, like where she'd be like, that doesn't ring true to me anymore.
Yeah.
Like you keep telling this story, but it's not even true.
Yeah.
So where like that whole semantic element of the memory isn't actually matching up with how the memories are actually functioning. So Augustine invites us to like move those building blocks around, like or recognize there's different building blocks that are at play here. How do you construct those? How do you tell that story? So now if I told a conversion story, it would have to start sounding a little different, right? I start thinking back, I remember like in 8th grade when I was at the funeral of my art teacher. Like, you begin
right.
moments.
Dude, so there is something about being willing, when we are willing to turn back and actually look at something, no matter how painful or difficult or no matter how disintegrated it might feel, when we're willing to turn back and look at it, sometimes we can begin to see the real narrative thread, the real narrative arc. And I think it depends on maybe what thread we're looking for too. If the thread or arc we're looking for is God's grace in it, that can be more cohesive and coherent than, I don't know.
Why I chose to. If you start asking, like, why did I do that? You often aren't going to get to a very good answer.
Yeah.
I think the other two is like, we often want like a simple narrative for ourselves. So I think it's like an easier story for me to tell, to just be like,
100%.
I was a crappy kid, and then which I wasn't really, but like to just be like, I didn't really care about God, and then I went to college and I cared about God, and I had this conversion. And, but to be like, no, you had this interior space and you were like awkwardly like standing in the sanctuary to be as close to the tabernacle as possible. But at the same time, you like had these sins in your life and you were like a prideful sophist. You like delighted in just debating for the sake of it and crushing people with your words.
You were Augustine.
That's part of why I love him, totally. No. There's a whole autobiographical symmetry we have. And that's like harder to admit because then there's something uncomfortable about that, right? Then you have to admit like somehow I was the kind of young man who could go in and put my face as close to the tabernacle as humanly possible, but at the same time be a jerk and pretend to be a Marxist just to rile up my teacher who was had to be airlifted out of Castro's Cuba and leave her parents as part of an airlift, and so I would just pretend to be a communist to be obnoxious to her. Which now in hindsight, I'm like, well, this is like a trauma. She had to like leave her parents.
100%, dude. You should probably write her and say sorry for being totally honest. I have a book. In my book, Finding Freedom, I have a whole step on like going back and making it right, dude.
Sorry, Miss Vicky Schmidt for terrorizing. No, the funny thing is,
you escaped communism to only face like a 16-year-old who thought he knew. Like you talk about
Miss Randall, all these I had all these wonderful Cuban teachers who were either their parents escaped or they escaped.
Survived
so
Castro.
Vicky Schmidt, she herself didn't escape.
Okay,
I think it was her parents.
Got it.
But then Mrs. Randall, she actually escaped herself. So as did our bishop at the time. So here I am just being this obnoxious guy, like pretending to be Marxist.
Shane Owens, just.
But so then you have to deal with that. It's like what was going on in me where I simultaneously was doing that, and that gets the harder picture to begin.
That's the harder picture.
But especially you have to be brought before yourself. You have to actually deal with that you're an incongruous person, like you're uneven. You're a lumpy mold, piece of clay that God's trying to mold.
Yeah, that's why I like to emphasize the important point that to be brought back before ourselves will be difficult and hard, and we will have to digest some really big and unpleasant truths about ourselves. To be brought back before ourselves is to be brought back before that kind of complexity, and it wasn't all bad, it wasn't all good. And there was good, which makes the bad all the more painful. And it's easy to cast our parents in a certain light. Oh, well, my parents no, it was like complex. I loved them greatly, and I know they love me, and they did something, but they also hurt me. Like, to go back and look honestly is much more difficult than to paint a simple picture. And so that idea of having to go back and return to myself, that it's going to be hard. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be difficult. It's not for the faint of heart at all. Are we getting the
Yeah, we're gonna a little motion. Our hard drive is about to run out of memory.
our heart drive? No, I love that, man. I actually really relate to that. There's something very true about that. My story is complex, and it's easy to write it quickly, or to speak about it quickly or in broad strokes. Broad strokes is less painful. It's less difficult. It's less confusing. But to really sit in it and to return to myself and say, no, I actually had these thoughts and these feelings and these desires, but yet I did all these things. In some ways, my story mirrors yours similarly.
And what I love about what you're saying with counseling is that, like, most people, it's slowly. It means there's repetition. Like, they have weekly appointments or bi-weekly or whatever they have. Like, they're doing hard work. Like, It's not like the counseling gets easy, right? For both the counselor and the client. Like, there's something that's happening. And I think a lot of us might have the instinct that we go on a retreat.
Yep.
Or we're going to go, it's Lent, I'm going to do this. But that it's the regular practice. It's the daily examine
100%.
of, like, I had this conversation today when I was walking to Mass, and, someone said something to me, and then I thought about it all Mass. Why did that bother me so much?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's doing that every day to recognize, okay, what about that triggered something? What about that conversation, right? But that takes work. You have to do that.
It takes
constantly.
real work. And part of what you're saying is, it's funny because even as a therapist, if I'm not doing that work on myself, when I see you inviting me to be drawn into that cave, and I anticipate some of the gremlins or little monsters that are going to jump out, if I know they're going to activate or trigger me, if I know that they're going to bring up memories it's really easy. There's different phrases for this in therapy, but it's really easy for me to see you going to a place that I think is going to make me feel uncomfortable.
So you as a therapist avoid it.
Yeah. And so as a therapist, you can very easily, when you see a client going somewhere that is going to activate or trigger you, old memories, uncomfortable feelings, subtly shift the conversation. The question you ask brings you in a different direction. Or you say, oh, that was interesting. But you said something earlier I was wondering about, and you just, because you're avoiding your own memories or feelings, and so as a result of that, you're not willing to go with the client to a place that would be helpful or healing to them. And so it's like so important, even as a therapist, to be doing your own work and to be willing to face those places and spaces, because undoubtedly your client, and I see this in my marriage, I see this with my kids, I see this.
You were asking earlier about the practical input.
Yeah, there it is.
If we want to love people,
there it is.
Like, I want to love the number of times when I'm as a dad or a husband, I'm like, I have to figure out how to be a better dad.
There it is. There it is.
The work is.
And what am I avoiding? What's the thing in me that I think is going to come up if I see this in my kid, or that I just am not ready to go there, see that, or I'm better able to love when I'm doing that work myself, returning to myself over and over. Dude, this was awesome. We have to have Rashad on. He's going to be great.
Yeah.
Thanks for this convo. I feel like it'll make me a better therapist. Hopefully. Thanks for watching, y'all.